Why did I hit send? Because it was the right thing to do.
Alberta Williams, a murder case that had long gone cold.
It's been incredibly challenging. I think this is the hardest story that I've ever worked on.
Every investigator has a tunnel vision, and you have to pull the blinders off.
Of the hundreds who are saved on the seas here, they're obviously the lucky ones.
They're stunned, they're crying, some of them are trembling. They can't believe they survived.
I'm Diana Swain. We're the investigators. This is what we do. Where do investigative journalists get their stories? What are the challenges in covering them? That's what we want to do with this program, take you deeper into that. Most investigations begin with a tip, but the tip that landed in Connie Walker's inbox was unlike any other and is now drawing attention to a crime that had all but been forgotten. A chilling email with the subject line, Alberta Williams murder.
And why did I hit send? Because it was the right thing to do.
A retired RCMP investigator haunted by the killing of a young Indigenous woman nearly 3 decades ago. Alberta Williams went missing near Prince Rupert, British Columbia in 1989.
If I didn't turn my head away, then she would be here.
Her family's questions about what happened have never been answered. No charges laid, the cold case sitting dormant until now. Gary Kerr's email to Connie Walker sparking a major CBC News investigation and an 8-part podcast.
Well, to be quite blunt with you, if I can, when you called me back, I almost didn't even know if I should answer the phone. Because it was like, oh my God, what have I done?
So the podcast has started. The first episode has gone out. That was on Tuesday. What kind of response and reaction has it gotten?
It's been actually really, I've been blown away by the response. There's a lot of interest in this story. I think there's a lot of interest in this issue in general, missing murdered Indigenous women. But I mean, I think that tip has really compelled a lot of people to pay attention. I mean, why is a former RCMP officer speaking out after, about a 27-year-old homicide case?
So let's talk about that. Yeah. What motivated him to start this dialogue with you? Because we heard him say, look, I pressed send on that email, and then when you called me back, I was like, what have I done?
I think it was an impulse, really. I think that, he's retired now, but he worked in major crimes for over 30 years, and he's still clearly so involved and invested in his cases, even though he's not really working on them anymore. And he saw a news article that had Alberta's photo in it, and he said it just brought everything back, and I sent the email on an impulse, and he definitely hesitated when we called him back. But I think, he says this is the right thing to do. He's always believed that Alberta's murder could be solved. He always felt like they were so close to solving it. And it's, you always remember the unsolved cases, he says.
So you finally had that meeting with him in his house, as we can see. So let's hear a bit more of that.
Sure.
I don't know if I can imagine a worse type of death, because if the person that I think is responsible, that's somebody you should have been able to really trust, which to me, and again, my opinion only, is this wasn't a stranger on stranger. I mean, it was the furthest thing from it.
I mean, wow, it sort of really pulls you in with that. He clearly believes he knows who did this.
Yes.
And wants this resolved, but that means revisiting everything for the family too.
Yeah, exactly. But, it's been 27 years, but I don't think that this is something the family has ever gotten over. They've always wanted to know the truth about what happened to Alberta. They have had their own suspicions. Her sister Claudia was with her the night she disappeared, and she just replays that moment of the last time she saw her sister over and over and over again. So even though it's a painful thing to revisit, it's something, they're still searching for justice. They believe that they'll see justice, even though it's been 27 years. I spoke with Claudia. Here's a little bit about what she had to say about that night.
She was calling me to go with her. I don't know if it would have made the situation worse, or it could have been both of us, or it could have been the other way. She could be here today, and it could be me in her shoes.
What's this been like to work on this project? Because people are clearly very emotional about what happened, still trying to wrestle with what happened and no answers. But beyond covering one story, this is an 8-part podcast now. I know you've been working on this for months with your producer. What's this been like to be pulled into the depth of this story?
It's been incredibly challenging. I think this is the hardest story that I've ever worked on for a number of reasons. It's obviously such an emotional subject matter, and it's really difficult to hear from Claudia, to be the person sitting next there, and then to relive all of these painful memories. But just ethically and journalistically, it's raised some really, really tough questions, and we've really had to have some really hard conversations about what we were going to do. We have this suspect that was named in the email, and we had to decide: are we going to name this person? He's never been charged with a crime. He's never been convicted, and we've decided to name this person later on as we get into the series, and we can provide more context. But it's been a really challenging investigation. But I think that this is an important story, not just for Alberta's family for finding out the truth, but to tell the bigger issue, to tell stories about the bigger issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women.
Well, that first podcast was gripping. I can't wait to hear the next one. So good luck with that, and thanks for telling us about it.
Thanks, Diana.
Investigative journalists often shed new light on old criminal cases with real impact.
We have Stephen Avery in custody, though.
The series Making a Murderer called into question the motives of U.S. law enforcement.
The police call you and say, "Do you know where Haley is?"
The podcast serial was downloaded nearly 100 million times and led to a murder conviction being overturned.
James Ford Seal has been indicted by a federal grand jury.
Canadian filmmaker David Ridgen's work on the 2007 CBC documentary Mississippi Cold Case led to a conviction against a former Ku Klux Klansman, bringing closure to the families of two African-American men who were kidnapped and killed in 1964.
On May 18, 1993, Christine Heron of Hanover, Ontario, went to school and disappeared forever.
Police reopened an investigation into that disappearance after Ridgen produced the documentary Confession to Murder for the CBC in 2012. Earlier this month, Anthony Edward Ringel pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison. David, take me back about 5 years to Christine Heron and your involvement with that. How did that start?
Well, Christine's case was interesting because there had been a confession in it. Anthony Ringel had confessed to killing her, and then police had investigated, and it was thrown out of court, and basically nothing ever happened. And it was left that way because there was a publication ban, and I wanted to look more into that. How could someone confess to a killing and then get away with it, and nothing happened? So I got the documents, looked through them, and found out that it was police mistakes that had led to the throwing out of the case. And it was like 6 years later, I went up, found Anthony. I was the first and only, I think, reporter ever to speak to him, or filmmaker. And that's how it happened. I mean, it's this easy 1, 2, 3.
So what was it like for you in the moment when you saw that he was finally going to be held accountable for what he'd done?
Well, it was satisfying because he had basically admitted to exactly the same elements of, well, I guess the murder of Chrissy as he did back in 2004. So there's a consistency to me. And to me, there was always a question as to whether he was faking the confession. And to me, it was an ironclad confession, like he actually did it. And to me, that was satisfying. And what was mostly satisfying was to see the reaction of the family, how they dealt with the loss of their child, and then participated in helping to solve the case, basically, or at least get the case back into the police's attention. Because as soon as we went to air, it was like 2012, I think May 2012, June 2012, they started their investigation at the same trailer park.
I was just talking to Connie Walker about this investigation she's a part of, and this is new. She hadn't done this before, and most journalists, frankly, have not followed a case all the way through. And I was saying, what's it like to be kind of trying to find that line journalistically between I've got to be objective, but how do I not get pulled deeply into the emotion of this? You've had more experience with it. Where is the line for you?
Well, in my experience, the more deeply I get pulled in, the better work I do in some ways. I feel like I have to be passionate about the case. I have to be passionate about the victim and the victim's family. But also, you have a journalistic responsibility to follow the puck in a responsible way and to deliver a balanced version of the story, to get to the subject's version, like the target or the sort of target of the investigation or the prime suspect's version of what happened. But after that, if you can immerse yourself, the passion, I think, drives the story to some extent. I mean, in Mississippi, where I worked on another case, and in Christine Heron's case, you're kind of part of the story as well as driving the story at the same time. So people are making news about you, about me.
But do you have to test yourself in your own thinking about what the answer is and maybe who done it? Do you have to test that the whole way to make sure
Always.
you're not going down the wrong track?
Always, because every investigator has a tunnel vision, and I mean, I'm sure you've experienced it too. You want something to come true. It's like, oh, wouldn't it be great if I interviewed the guy and he actually did it, and this really makes sense because of this, and you have this tunnel vision, and you have to pull the blinders off every single time you look at any information in the case. And in the case I'm working on now for the podcast, Someone Knows Something, it's exactly the same. Everybody thinks they know who did it, or they knew who did it.
It's fascinating work. Thanks for talking about it.
Thank you.
Police in the U.S. are using a novel way of cracking cold cases, handing out decks of playing cards to prisoners, hoping that details about cold cases printed on the cards could jog some memories, and it's been working. The approach is being used in more than a dozen states now and has led to hundreds of new leads, perhaps inspired by the U.S. military.
55 individuals who may be pursued, killed, or captured,
which famously handed out decks of cards during the Iraq War, a technique in their search for Saddam Hussein and his top aides. We're also digging into a Fifth Estate investigation.
Of the hundreds who are saved on the seas here, they're obviously the lucky ones.
What it's like to witness this desperate escape across the Mediterranean. And
you vote for her, you're crazy, okay?
The U.S. election is about to enter the final week. Are both candidates getting enough scrutiny? But first, if circus clowns creep you out, you might want to cover your eyes for a minute, because creepy clown sightings have lately been making the news.
It's a spooky trend. Incidents involving clowns.
Creepy clown sightings are becoming more common.
Creepy clowns have been hanging out in random parts of town.
It may be weird to dress like a clown and run around, but it's not criminal, so is it news? No matter, the fear of clowns has ballooned.
People thought clowns were in our school and that they were gonna kill a bunch of people.
Prompting retailers like Canadian Tire to pull clown-themed Halloween decorations from its shelves. A Toronto area municipality has asked trick-or-treaters to ditch their clown costumes, and McDonald's is giving its trademark character Ronald McDonald some time off. So there's lots of fear out there, but of what exactly? A story without any real scrutiny isn't much of a story. Just ask Dee Dee the Clown in Winnipeg.
People are passing on incorrect information. They're not doing their actual fact finding.
We agree. If there's a real story here, let's hear it. Otherwise, let's stop clowning around. Here are 5 things we learned this week from investigative journalists. An investigation by CBC's Go Public and Marketplace discovered massive piles of unspoiled food being thrown out by Walmart Canada stores. The company has acknowledged mistakes and is vowing to do better. CBC News learned the RCMP is about to face a class action harassment lawsuit from male employees. It's already agreed to a $100 million settlement with female workers. South Korea's president was forced to apologize after journalists revealed she'd given classified documents to a close friend. An Indigenous man who was held in solitary confinement for 4 years has been moved to another cell. The story of Adam Cappe's segregation in an Ontario jail led to public outrage and legal challenges. And CBC News confirmed that a tip from a mental health center led to the arrest of an Ontario nurse. Elizabeth Wetlaufer is charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder in connection with several nursing home deaths. Here's a question journalists around the world are asking: how to cover the worst humanitarian crisis since the Second World War. Millions of people on the move, many escaping violence and oppression, risking everything to get to Europe. Many have died trying. The numbers are staggering. 3,740 people have drowned in the Mediterranean so far this year. Tens of thousands have been plucked from overcrowded boats.
Yes, I was scared, but just by God's grace we are here, so thank God.
Survivors sharing their stories with journalists like the CBC's Nala Ayed, who was recently allowed on one of those rescue vessels to watch as it patrolled the waters off Libya.
Of the hundreds who are saved on the seas here, they're obviously the lucky ones. There's no way of knowing how many more people out there leave Libya on the way to Europe who are not saved and never found.
Okay, first things first, how did you get on that boat?
Well, obviously it doesn't happen overnight, and it happened in the context of that massive story last year of the influx of people into Europe. It was the one leg of that journey that we had not experienced, but the Fifth Estate stayed on it. It took a year, the producer there, Tamar Weinstein, making the calls, and eventually we were given permission to get on.
So you're on this boat. These people are literally being hauled out of the water, being saved from death in the water. What were they like? How did they present to you?
It's really stark when you look at their faces coming out, just how stunned they are. Because I don't think they knew. In fact, many of the people we spoke to knew how long it would take to be on the water, what it would feel like, and how close they are to the risk that, of course, the rescuers know, but they didn't know. They were told it would take 2 hours.
And how does that not get back to them? Because it seems like the rest of the world knows how perilous these journeys have been, how many people have died. How is the word not filtering back?
It's a good question. I would say part of it is perhaps because they're actually held in holding centers on the coast of Libya to leave, sometimes for months. And so they are cut off from the outside world. They don't hear what you and I hear.
So now that they're on this boat, traumatized, in shock, how do you navigate that moment where you're saying, hi, I'm Nala Ayed from CBC, I'd like to talk to you?
Yeah, well, you don't do it the moment they come out, obviously, because as I said, they're stunned, they're crying, some of them are trembling, they can't believe they've survived. And so you give them some time. But we did go up to people, and it's amazing, not a single person said no. I think there's a lot of desire to tell their story.
Do they understand what awaits them? That there is this real resistance in many parts of the world to taking them in?
Yeah, it's a question I asked every single person we interviewed, and to the one they said they had not heard that there was aversion in some parts of Europe to arrivals, and so no, they don't. They have people who are telling them that now. We were on the boat, and they were already being told it's not going to be as easy as you think.
In your book that was released just a couple of years ago, 1,000 Farewells, you talk about your own personal experience living in a refugee camp for a part of your youth. Did that give you a connection to them? It's not exactly the same experience, but that sense of being displaced.
Absolutely. I mean, that whole larger story of the massive displacement that's going on right now, 65.3 million people, the most ever, on the move because of either war or because of oppression. And so absolutely that connects to my family history, connects to other people's and Canada's story, really.
Right.
So I do feel a lot of connection with them, and I feel that there are parallel experiences.
Even as I hear you say the number, though, I mean, it sounds absurd. It sounds like a made-up, crazy, extreme number.
Yeah. It does, and I think a lot of people don't think about where it happens too. I mean, we don't know. I heard the stories of people walking through the Sahara to try to get away from Eritrea, or having to deal with organ traffickers or human smugglers along the way to survive to get to Libya, just to get to the sea. So we get numbers, but we don't see the journey. We don't understand just how tough it is for some of these people crossing borders and Saharas and deserts just to get somewhere safe.
Thanks for sharing this.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
This is what many of those refugees are escaping. But what should we call the group behind so much violence? Is it ISIS, ISIL, or Daesh? You asked, we're getting answers later. Plus,
and rig the election.
We're digging into those claims that the media is rigging the election. Got a story tip for the investigators? Share it anonymously at securedrop.cbc.ca. You can also contact us through email. That's investigators@cbc.ca, or just say hi on Twitter @Swain Diana. You're watching The Investigators on CBC News Network. On this program, we want to bring you inside the investigations we do and the decisions that we make. And so every week we invite you to ask me anything about investigative journalism. Now this week, Kathy reached out to us to ask about our coverage of the so-called Islamic State. She wants to know why the CBC continues to call it ISIS when some other organizations call it ISIL or even Daesh. It's a good question, and I don't have the answer. So we reached out to the CBC's Jack Nagler.
Diana, it's surprising how complicated this is. First, it's a given that you have to choose a term that's accurate, but then you have to think about the effect it has on the tone of our coverage. For instance, if we were to use the term Islamic State, it might mislead people by implying that this is a real country. If you were to say something like Daesh, which is an acronym that group finds insulting, you might actually be seen as taking sides when we have an obligation to remain impartial. But the biggest consideration of all, frankly, is clarity. The audience needs to understand what we're saying. And we know that when we use the term ISIS, people get it more often than they do with all the other options. Now, do I recognize the downsides? Do we understand the downsides that your viewer has raised here? Absolutely. And it's just one reason why we continue to discuss this term in the newsroom.
Got a question? We'll try to get you the answer. Just email us, investigators@cbc.ca.
The 2016 presidential election, or as it's more commonly known, the electoral equivalent of seeing someone puking, so you start puking and then someone else is puking, and pretty soon everyone is puking 2016.
Yep, seems even the comedians are running out of ways to describe the seemingly endless American presidential campaign. But in just days, it will be over. Advance voting is already underway in the United States. Donald Trump says the voting is rigged and the media is to blame, that there's been too much scrutiny of him and not enough of his opponent. He has a point. A website in the United States called The Dataface looked at headlines on 8 major news websites dating back to July of last year and found Trump's name appeared in headlines of news stories more than twice as often as Clinton's. The revelations about Hillary Clinton's musings in speeches, questionable donations to her family foundation, and uncomfortably close relationship with some reporters do deserve more attention. But Trump keeps trumping the coverage with his own eyebrow-raising musings, questionable donors, and awkward interactions. There's an easy way to stay out of the headlines. Stop creating them. Trump's official Twitter page has sent out nearly 34,000 tweets. Many of those have fueled the news cycle that he's unhappy about. Clinton's campaign, by contrast, has sent out just over 9,000. Napoleon famously said, "Never interfere with your enemy when he's making a mistake." It seems Clinton has heard that phrase. It's not clear that Trump ever has. I'm Diana Swain, and this is The Investigators.